So I remember years ago I took this course called Good Leaders, Good Shepherds, which was hosted by the Archdiocese of Toronto. And the whole point of the course was to teach pastors and future pastors different principles pertaining to organizational behavior to bring to bear in the context of pastoral settings. And one of the things they kind of taught us early on, this particular point I always remembered, of course, this notion that when you give an envisioning homily, a homily which is meant to articulate the vision of the parish, you can't just give it as a one-time thing, but you need to, in a certain sense, to give a variation of that same homily throughout the course of your tenure with the parish. Because the whole idea is you want to keep at the forefront of people's minds this notion that, in the words of Pope Francis, the church is inherently missionary. So the church doesn't just have a mission, the church actually is a mission, right? And so, given all that, what I want to do is give a variation of a homily that I typically give in retreat settings, talking about the mission of the church. So as a starting point, it's important to kind of remember that the mission of the church is actually clearly defined in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, the Great Commission. So what you hear basically is that the mission of the church is to make disciples of all nations, to make disciples of all nations. And to be a disciple means that you become the master, right? So to put it all together in terms of a Christian context, the mission of the church is to make other Christ in this world, beginning with ourselves. Now, one book I've always found really helpful in this regard is written by someone named Sherry Weddell, where she talks about different steps in terms of discipleship building. And that book is called Forming Intentional Disciples. Forming Intentional Disciples. So what I want to do at this point is walk you through these different steps that Sherry Weddell talks about and give kind of brief comments with regards to each. So basically, she articulates like 5 steps when it comes to discipleship building, right? So first of all, there's trust. Second, there's curiosity, followed by openness, followed by spiritual seeking, followed by intentional discipleship. So trust, curiosity, openness, spiritual seeking, and intentional discipleship. So again, just to walk you through these things one at a time. First of all, the notion of trust. When it comes to evangelization, when it comes to discipleship building, the first step is this notion of trust. So when you think about trust, the idea is that certain things are secondary, but certain things are primary. Certain things are important, but certain things are essential. And the thing which is primary, the thing which is essential, is the presence you bring. So quite apart from what you're saying, quite apart from how clever you might be, the idea is, do people trust you? Do they like you? Do they feel safe in your presence? If that's not in place, the game is over before it actually begins. So you need to establish this foundation of trust. And Sherry Weddell talks about this. She says trust is basically giving people a positive association with something identifiably Catholic or Christian. So because that is primary, because that is essential, you want to make sure you really take your time to establish this foundation of trust. Second thing is this notion of curiosity. So curiosity. Curiosity with regards to the Christian faith, right? So I'm merely curious about perhaps learning more about the Christian faith, quite apart from any sense of commitments. So what do you do at this stage? Something I find really helpful is to bring to bear the positive side of evangelization. So you always have to remember that evangelization has kind of 2 sides, right? The positive aspect, but the negative aspect as well. So I think we tend to remember the negative aspect, right? So the negative aspect of evangelization, it's not bad, but it's simply pointing out that in the culture which is incompatible with the gospel truth. Obviously really, really important. But I think what we tend to forget as a Christian people is the other side. Again, the positive side of evangelization. So let's say, for example, you're having a conversation with someone, dare we say in arguments, about a particularly contentious issue. The idea is that in the midst of this discussion, in the midst of this disagreement or argument, I should still be able to identify and affirm and reflect back to the other person things that they're saying, things that they're doing in terms of the good and the true and the beautiful. People can't help but aspire to the good. You know, the human heart is truly restless until it rests in the Lord. So again, this person might be years from being in a stance of intentional discipleship, but at the same time, there's things that they're doing, things that they're saying which are, again, good and true and beautiful. Do I have the wherewithal to recognize these things, affirm these things, celebrate these things, and reflect it back in the midst of the conversation, which might be framed in terms of an argument at the same time? It takes practice to make this thing a habit, but you're buying something with your money, right? You're establishing a foundation of relationship, which is really important at this early stage of the game. The next stage is openness. So the image that comes to mind is this idea of dipping your toe in the proverbial waters, right? So at this point, I am open to the possibility of change. So what do you do to kind of grease the wheels in this regard? A couple of things come to mind. First of all, to recognize opportunities. Just by virtue of just knowing yourself and knowing other people, there are certain moments in life where people are more open to receiving the gospel truth. And am I aware of those moments? And do I rise to the occasion? Bishop Robert Barron talks about this in terms of limited experiences. Moments when people are feeling kind of stressed or overwhelmed, or they're going through some sort of variation of wrestling with their own humanity and mortality. Those are moments where people tend to be more open to the gospel truth. It's the reason why people are more open to receiving God's word at funerals as opposed to weddings. So am I aware of the opportunity, and do I rise to the occasion? The other thing that comes to mind, though, is to recognize that the Mass is not meant to be the primary means of evangelization. The Mass is not meant to be the primary means of evangelization. That might sound controversial, but I don't think it is, actually. To put it succinctly, the Mass is kind of weird, right? It's not really intuitive. You can't expect to put someone in the middle of Mass without any kind of prior education or knowledge and expect them to understand what's going on. It's kind of convoluted. You have to learn the Mass. You need to be taught about the Mass. Certainly when that happens, when you have education with regards to the liturgy, the whole thing comes alive in a really beautiful sort of way. And on top of that, obviously the Eucharist is the source and center of our faith, the real presence of Christ. But at the same time, more to the point, you can't expect the Mass to be something that's not meant to be. It's primarily an act of worship. It's not meant to be the primary means of evangelization or catechesis, which means I need to be aware of other things out there in terms of Catholic culture. Different programs, different events, different books, different podcasts, different people that I can introduce people to help them in their spiritual journey. The next stage is this notion of spiritual seeking, right? Spiritual seeking. So the image that comes to mind here is intentional dating. I'm dating the Lord with the intention of marriage, if you will, right? So what can you do to help someone at this particular stage? What comes to mind is this notion of kind of boning up your apologetics game. You probably know this, but just to make sure we're on the same page, apologetics is not like apologizing for being Catholic, right? So apologetics is having an acute understanding as to the why behind the what. Why is it that we do the things that we do? Why is it that we believe the things that we believe? And the invitation is to kind of broaden your knowledge base, to have a certain flexibility. So no matter who I'm talking to, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the issue, I'm able to give an intelligent, convincing response in terms of the question, why do you do these things? Why do you believe what you believe? Now the final stage, again, is intentional discipleship. Intentional discipleship, and this is reflected recurrently in the gospel, the calling of the first disciples. Whenever you find this kind of drop the nets moment, that's intentional discipleship. I choose to turn my back on my former way of being, my former way of life, to follow the Lord with the intention of becoming another Christ in this world. The thing I want to impress upon you is that it doesn't end here. So intentional discipleship, even after you make that preliminary choice, it's meant to be an ongoing thing which takes the rest of your life. And people tend to forget this. One of my pet peeves is that when people give their vocation story, or they talk about their conversion story, it's something like this. A long time ago, I used to be involved in evil and wicked stuff, nefarious things, but then I met the Lord, and now I'm this. And you, if you work hard, you could be this too. Missing a little something, right? The ongoing nature of conversion. The idea is that I need to be acutely aware of the fullness of that which Christ wants to give to me. And by definition, that takes a lifetime. And the idea is that if you're acutely aware of this, the clarity in terms of the ongoing nature of conversion, it keeps you safe when it comes to evangelization. I will never be arrogant, I'll never be rude, I'll never be condescending, but instead there'll be a sense of journeying with. I'm journeying with you to receive together the fullness of that which Christ wants to give to us. Okay, one final note on with this. So years ago, when I took possession of not just this parish, but the other parishes as well, I remember introducing myself to the parish leaders, the leaders of our various parish groups, and just talking to them about the mission of the church and the parish vision and sort of thing. But I thought recently, maybe it might be helpful to kind of share basically the bullet points with regards to that conversation with the parish community. So basically the gist of it is this. What I said to our parish leaders so many years ago was that, look, coming out of COVID lockdown, in a certain sense, the world and the church have been changed forever. So the sense of evangelization based on duty or obligation is not really convincing if it was ever convincing back in the day, right? So the challenge and the invitation is to convince people out there in the world that what we do has value. What we do has infinite value. And practically speaking, that means a couple things, right? You can't reduce evangelization to mere advertising. And we do this all the time. Sometimes evangelization is reduced to just come to the party. The real reason that people aren't receiving the fullness of the Christian thing is we don't have good advertising. We need to have more posters, postings in the bulletin, more announcements from the pulpit. It's not so much comes to the party. The question is, do people perceive value in our party? If not, they won't come, and if not, they won't stay. The other thing that comes to mind now, too, is this notion of raising the bar. Recurrently, since I've been a priest, time and time again, you hear the pitch to be something like this. Come join our parish. Come join our parish group, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to invest your time or energy, just maybe pay your dues and give money in the collection, and we're happy to have you, right? I want to suggest to you that that's not really compelling. Even though it might sound counterintuitive, the way to draw people in is not to lower the bar, but to actually raise the bar. And you got to find your own way, right? So when you're in that situation, you got to find your own pitch. But I would suggest something like this. I know that you're busy. Like, we're all busy, right? But the invitation is, come join us in this beautiful thing that we're doing and this beautiful thing that we're building together. And it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. Anything of value requires both of those things. And because we're talking about God, because we're talking about the gospel, it's actually going to require the gift of your entire self. But the thing I want to impress upon you is that it is worth it. It's worth it. You'll come to experience a peace and a joy and a freedom and a sense of purpose and mission and dynamism that you've always been looking for, the deep desires of the human heart. So come join us in this beautiful thing that we're doing, this beautiful thing that we're building together. Now, when you hear that, you might think to yourself, well, gosh, that's not my experience of the faith on an individual level and certainly on a parish level, but therein lies an opportunity for all of us to discover together the fullness of that which Christ has always wanted to give to us. And insofar as we grow in that regard and discover the fruits of this personal inquiry, that's the thing that we share with other people. And that's the thing that's convincing. And that, my friends, is evangelization.